this video on grain direction, why do we care? I'm going to talk about why we care because it affects everything from how we chuck it, how the tools we use, how do we use them, how do we embellish it, how do we finish it. Let's get started.
Grain direction affects our projects in a number of ways, starting with our choice of turning blanks. For example, if we're turning a bowl, we normally select cross-grained blanks. Why, do you ask? Well, it's generally a stronger bowl. It's also easier to turn. End grain is very hard and more difficult to cut.
I made the small bowl with a pedestal base so the bottom would be stronger. If I drop it, it's unlikely to break. But this large end grain cherry bowl, probably 14 inches across, is quite fragile. If I drop it, it would surely break where a cross-grain bowl would probably not break. Now let me illustrate the difference in strength between long grain, in other words spindle orientation, where the tree is in this orientation, versus the tree in this orientation where this is face grain. So if we were turning a bowl, it would be going in this direction. So if we take this spindle orientation, this thin sliver, we can bend it very stiffly, and it's very strong because the fibers are going this way. Where the short fibers are going this way, though, for essentially the same piece, it'll snap quite easily.
If turning most spindle projects, we tend to select blanks with grain running parallel to the lathe bed because it's stronger. Here's an example of how we're cutting a spindle orientation on this candlestick, or perhaps it's a box. It's also easier to slice or peel with side grain, which affects the tools we use. We select some turning blanks for the tight straight grain. Straight grain is essential for certain projects, especially thin or detailed turnings, such as finials, thin-stemmed goblets, and perhaps even chessmen. Tight straight grain is almost essential for doing hand thread chasing.
Let's talk about knots. Knots can cause cracking on green bowls when they're turning. Here's an example of a small crack. It goes all the way through. This is not a big deal. I can fill this, but in some instances it could be a lot more catastrophic. Let me show you another example of how a knot can also cause deformation. Here's an example of a Bradford pear chalice, and it looks good from this side, but when we move it around, you can see this small knot right here, and then it changes because it deforms the wood and causes somewhat of a collapse. It winds up becoming a very odd looking shape, which in this particular instance is not desirable. Now in some instances the bulge caused by a knot might be attractive. For example, in this potpourri bowl, where I would consider it maybe a positive feature, or in this kitchen caddy where it's a design feature. Now Burl type of grain is a lot like having lots of tiny knots coming out all over. It can cause a beautiful appearance, such as in this cherry bowl, but if it's turning green, the bowl can deform when drying. The burl can also be extremely dense and hard to cut. Here's an example of a knot going through a spindle blank, and you can see why this would be a very bad idea to use something like this, for example, as a stool leg, because of the incredible weakness that it would create if this knot came out and became loose.
Grain also affects how we mount the blank we're going to turn. For example, if we use a screw chuck or woodworm screw, we're not going to use those generally for end grain because they do better on side grain projects. Side grain tends to hold threads better, which is why I make threaded glue blocks from side grain and not parallel or spindle orientation grain.
Anyone that's worked with wood, especially on flat work projects such as making, say, cutting boards, you know that the grain movement this direction is more significant than it is running long ways. In other words, this is the tree orientation. For that reason, we tend to make boxes in spindle orientation with the grain running this direction, because we're going to have more of a uniform shrinkage, so the lid is going to be able to fit longer. And that's true even if we're going to have a threaded box even though the threads theoretically, or not theoretically, but they would be stronger if the grain was running this way, that advantage does not offset the effect of that if we did the grain this way, that the wood movement would be such that we may not be able to thread that top on during different times of the year.
We also orient it based on the appearance we want. For example, we might be turning a piece of a crotch blank where we've got a branch forking out, and we do this in order to get the best feather appearance of where that grain blends in the bottom, as is shown in this winged bowl. Whether we turn the bowl bark side up or bark side down makes a difference.
In this example of two rough turn bowls, the one on the left has the bark oriented on the bottom side, which is pretty common, and as a result it leaves these kind of H pattern in the middle of the bowl. This one's a little bit off center, but it tends to look something like this, whereas the one on the right, which is typical of the natural edge bowls, where the bark is on the top, you're going to either get a series of circles, or in this case ovals, based on the shape of this particular bowl. I don't find this to be quite as attractive unless it is a natural edge bowl.
The grain direction also affects our tool selection and use. For example, when we're doing that spindle or parallel with the lathe orientation of the grain, we tend to do slicing and peeling. So the tools we use for that is going to tend to be a spindle roughing gouge, or a spindle gouge, or a parting tool. And yet those same tools may not be as effective, and in some cases, as the example of the spindle roughing gouge, even dangerous on cross grain work.
We've talked about this many times before in earlier videos, but inevitably there's that new turner that doesn't get any instruction, doesn't watch demonstrations, just goes in their basement and starts trying to turn. That if we have a bowl, which is essentially cross grain work or face work, where the straws are oriented perpendicular to the lathe turning this way, they don't realize the significance of using a spindle roughing gouge to turn it, because they don't recognize the danger that coming along here is not a big problem, except these wings on the spindle roughing gouge can get you in trouble. But when it comes around here and it starts hitting end grain, which we know is very strong, it's going to create forces on the tool that it is not made to handle. It's got a very weak tang, and inevitably it will bend or break and possibly injure the turner. Knots can also affect what kind of tool we'd want to reach for. Now, in this 1.5 inch pine block, spindle blank, if I was turning it, I probably wouldn't be too terribly concerned by using my typical use of the spindle roughing gouge to take this from square to round. However, if it was much larger than this, I'd probably want to be reaching for a stronger bowl gouge.
Yet the stronger shaft strength of a bowl gouge is needed to hang over a tool rest when cutting deep into a bowl. Spindle tool would not be as effective for that. It would be more dangerous because it doesn't have as much steel underneath the flute. And the direction of the cut. We tend to cut on a bowl as shown in this diagram. On the outside, we tend to cut from the bottom of the bowl to the top. And on the inside of a bowl, we go in the opposite direction, because that's the cut that gives us the supported grain, where as we cut, we have fibers or the little straws that are in front of the cut supporting that cut. Cutting a direction on the spindle, we tend to go from large to small, and as a result that gives us that same supporting cut. So grain direction does make a difference on how we slice and cut. Finishing. Figured wood responds well to an oil finish to really make the grain pop. There's an example of how we're going to let grain direction affect us.
Bowls made out of burl are a really good example of how it's important to use some type of oil or oil finish, at least initially, in order to make the grain pop on that burl.
End grain tends to absorb finish more readily than side grain. As a result, it's going to be darker. So that means we're oftentimes going to seal that end grain with shellac or sanding sealer in order to reduce the absorption, so we don't have that big a difference in color from light to dark on different parts of the piece. Embellishing techniques are affected by grain direction. We typically embellish with texturing with woods that tend to be rather plain. An example is one of my favorite woods, Bradford pear, as shown in this spiraling on the outside of a bowl. Chatter only works for end grain. You're not going to do that on side grain. So there's how grain direction can affect on embellishing. Scorching wood is generally only used when there's a prominent grain structure with differences between fast growth and slow growth, as shown in this ash bowl.
And it takes a very open grain like ash or oak to be able to show off liming wax to its full advantage, as shown here.
Several years ago, I wrote an article for the American Association of Woodturners for posting on their website dealing with grain. So if you're interested in another more in-depth look on grain, you might be interested in checking out that video. I appreciate all your comments. Y'all stay safe and come on back here.